Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders and New York Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez drew some huge crowds in recent days, attacking what they say is a growing oligarchy while rallying out west.
We are witnessing an oligarchy in America. When those with the most economic, political, and technological power destroy the public good to enrich themselves.
We will not allow America to become an oligarchy. This nation was built by working people.
Now, the huge crowds prompting questions about whether Senator Sanders might be gearing up for another run for president. But the 83-year-old Vermonter brushed aside questions about his future during an interview over the weekend.
Right now, I'm Vermont Senator. That's what I do, and I'm very happy to do it. I am 83 years of age, and I'm tired.
Now on set, Nicholas Wu, congressional reporter for Politico, Meghan Hays, former special assistant to President Biden, and Rob Bluey, president and executive editor of the Daily Signal. Nicholas, for a party that we've been told doesn't have a leader, or some people doesn't have a leader, we look at Bernie Sanders and AOC out there drawing what are arguably huge crowds. That's what they are arguing. How big a deal are these big crowds?
Well, I think what we're seeing from those two figures is their very unique talent to draw a grassroots crowd in a way that most other figures in the Democratic Party simply can't. I mean, those are folks whose power really comes from outside the building rather than inside the building. And then as for the questions about their political futures, Senator Sanders has kind of indicated that this could be his last term in the Senate. He might probably won't run for president again. But there's a lot of questions about what AOC will do next and whether that translates into a Senate run or otherwise.
As you think about what we're seeing in these crowds, though, the size of these crowds, is this more of an ideological thing or a tactical thing that we're seeing play out? You have these two leaders who arguably have the same messaging or ideology as some in their houses of Congress, but perhaps their message about fighting back is something that's different?
Democrats I've talked to indicate that there's really a desire among the party, particularly their base, for fighters of some kind. Not necessarily in terms of differences in ideology with leadership, but more just in tactics. And in some ways, it's reminiscent of what we saw from Republicans during past Democratic administrations, where you saw a real demand from the Republican base for folks who would stand up to Obama or Biden. And now we're seeing that really play out among Democrats in real time.
So, Meghan, we heard from Bernie Sanders there. We look at him, obviously somebody who's been able to jazz up crowds for a long time, but he is 83 years old. He's probably not going to run for president again. Did you see AOC's presence as sort of a passing of the torch to have her and Bernie Sanders in these sorts of settings together?
Sure. I think that, much to your point, they energize a base and they energize a certain specific version of the Democratic Party, but I'm not sure that's where the whole Democratic Party is. And I think that they have their place, and it's great that they're out there and they elicit interesting conversations and it gets people excited and energized. But I'm not necessarily sure that's what's going to win elections, nationwide elections, as we look to who's going to run for president in 2028. I do not think Bernie Sanders will run for president in 2028, but I do think it is important to have them out there on the stump.
But if you were advising a Buttigieg or a Pritzker for 2028, how would you advise them to run against an AOC potentially?
I would tell them to move to the middle where the rest of the country is and where most of the country wants to talk about the economy and actual issues that impact their wallets and impact their kitchen table issues, as we like to say here in Washington, is what I would advise them to be out there talking about.
And Rob, as we think about the potential next presidential election cycle, we know that President Trump has been a part of the cycle for 3 cycles now, and at least as far as the Constitution is concerned, he won't be involved in another cycle. So who has the bigger challenge among the Republicans in trying to motivate voters when there's not a Donald Trump factor really at play?
That's a big question, because as Nicholas mentioned, the two figures that we've been talking about, AOC and Bernie Sanders, are similar in that they have those big personalities, and it seems that voters are attracted to them. J.D. Vance, I think, has some work to do to establish himself as the front runner. He won the CPAC straw poll, so he's on his way. But J.D. Vance has something unique that I think you heard both Bernie Sanders and AOC talking about, and that is the appeal to working class voters. He himself, through his own upbringing, I think will naturally be appealing to that group and talking about those kitchen table issues.
Nicholas, I want to ask you about some of your reporting on your beat in particular. We know President Trump came out in favor of impeaching federal judges that have blocked some of the things that he's been trying to do over the last several months here. How big an appetite is there on the Hill for that action, for the idea of impeaching judges?
There's a lot of appetite among very conservative, kind of firebrand Republicans for trying to impeach judges, but not enough to get that over the finish line. It's the kind of thing where 0 Democrats would vote for that, and there's a lot of hesitancy among Republicans, and it's something that even Speaker Johnson has acknowledged might not necessarily the votes to get through. Now, the question for Republican leaders, though, is how much of a headache that hardliners could make for them as they try to get this, these legislative items through with a very narrow majority.
Rob, I'm curious your perspective on this idea of impeaching judges. The president talking about it over and over again. We're seeing his social posts about it. Can a Speaker Johnson say no, just flat out no?
Well, he can do a couple of things. I mean, depending on whether it's a privileged resolution or whether it's not, I mean, he could just send this to a committee and have it probably die there. But, Aaron, I think the more important tack that Congress can do is something that Senator Mike Lee has announced that he's planning to do, and that's introduce legislation that curtails these nationwide or universal injunctions. I would rather see Republicans in Congress focus on that aspect because there actually is some bipartisan appeal. Joe Biden, his administration in January, asked the Supreme Court to rule on this as well. So I think that presidents have been frustrated that a single district court judge is able to impose law nationwide, whereas in the past they just focused very narrowly on their own district.
Meghan, you agree with that? I mean, is that something you think Democrats would get on board with to some degree?
I don't think right now that they're going to do that with the Trump administration. I think maybe in a different administration you might have had some luck. I don't think so they're going to do that in the Trump administration. I think that just gives the executive more power than they're willing to give right now.
I want to put up an op-ed, Meghan, from a longtime conservative judge, Michael Luttig. Judge Boasberg, he writes, doesn't want to assume the role of president. The president wants to assume the role of judge. If Mr. Trump continues to attempt to usurp the authority of the courts, the battle will be joined, and it will be up to the Supreme Court, Congress, and the American people to step forward and say enough. So where do you think this is going? Is there a point at which you think the White House is just particularly wrong on this issue?
I mean, I think that they're wrong that we have 3 co-equal branches of government and they're each going to do what they want to do. I think it's unprecedented that the Chief Justice put out a statement last week saying, do not use us as a pawn in your game. We are not going to be part of this. And I do think if it goes to the Supreme Court, it will not go in Donald Trump's favor. And I think that will be incredibly embarrassing to him.
Is that a gamble that you think Republicans, that you think this president is willing to take?
I do. I mean, let's face it. Conservatives have a majority on the court, so I think that it should ultimately be decided. Now, John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett on a previous case, though, did not rule in the direction that the president would have liked them to. So, I mean, there's always a risk there, Aaron, and I think that that's something they need to be mindful of. At the same time, I think that we are living in unprecedented times, and the fact that there are 130 lawsuits that this administration has faced. So there are battles across this country in the courthouse.
And Nicholas, we had another cabinet meeting today where we got a little bit of video from that. We were able to hear the president speak and several cabinet secretaries. The idea was that they went around the room and talked about the cuts that they're making, the spending changes that they're making, pledged their support to President Trump in his efforts to shrink the government, to shrink budgets. We're 2 months into this administration now. Is the White House struggling to sell this message to the American people at all? Is that some of what we're seeing play out as folks sort of weigh in on what's happening?
That's certainly a dynamic that we're seeing play out, especially over these past few weeks as Republican lawmakers went back home and did town halls. Certainly there's some controversy over the makeup of these town halls and who is doing the protesting, but certainly members are seeing a backlash back home against a lot of these cuts. And so the question now for the Trump administration is how you market those.
And Elon Musk, Rob, has been a big part of the imagery around these cuts and questions about whether they're too deep or too, just outside of what the American people want. Is Elon Musk still welcome at the table to the point where he's useful, or is there sort of diminishing returns with him?
He had a seat at the table today. I mean, he was in the cabinet room, so literally wearing the hat. So I think that to your previous question, though, where the administration needs to do a better job is making sure that the American people understand that these cuts will affect them in positive ways. The government spending was responsible for the inflation crisis that we experienced in the recent years. And so by reducing the role of government in our lives and cutting back on some of that spending, hopefully that translates into Americans being able to hold more of their money.
I don't think a single American that receives Social Security would benefit from them shutting down the Social Security agency.
Trump has said he's not going to touch Social Security.
That is not what they are saying, and that's not what the actions are. So I think that will be left to see with some of these other programs like Medicaid and Social Security.
We're out of time, but it sort of raises the point, is perception reality? If people out in middle America think that it's possible Social Security could go away, does it matter whether it actually doesn't happen in the short term? A question for another day. I just throw it out there. We'll try it again later. Nicholas, Meghan, and Rob, thank you all. Up next.